Okay, let's unpack this. We've got a stack of truly fascinating material here, all focused on the complex, often debated, but fundamentally important area of sex, gender, and androgyny in psychology.
Hmm.
If you're navigating this topic, maybe for a class or just out of sheer curiosity, this deep dive is definitely for you.
Absolutely. The sources you've shared give us a great map covering key definitions, major theories, and, those landmark studies.
Right.
Our goal isn't just to summarize, but to really dig into these ideas, find the crucial insights, and help you connect the dots.
Think of it as cutting through the noise to get straight to what matters most for really understanding this field. It's foundational to so much in psychology, identity, behavior, how we interact.
It really is.
So let's dive straight in.
Okay, so the absolute foundational concept your material emphasizes, the one you really need to get straight, is the distinction between sex and gender.
Right. This feels obvious on the surface, maybe, but it's where a lot of confusion can start, isn't it? Sex, as it's used here, refers to biological characteristics, chromosomes, hormones, anatomy,
Mhm.
typically male or female.
Exactly. And then gender. That's where I get into the psychological and social stuff.
Uh-huh.
This is about your identity, how you see yourself, and the behaviors, traits, roles, all the things society tends to associate with masculinity or femininity.
So big picture. Sex is biological, gender is psychological and social. And the key thing, like your sources make really clear, is that these two things don't always line up neatly for everyone.
No, they don't. And building on that, your sources talk about sex roles and stereotypes. Sex roles are basically those societal expectations about how people of a certain sex or gender should act.
Yeah, and what's striking is how much these roles shift, isn't it? Your material points out they vary hugely across cultures
Hmm.
and have changed dramatically, even in recent history.
Hmm.
The classic example given is that 1950s expectation. Homemaker wives, breadwinner husbands, roles that look very different for many people today.
Exactly. But when those expectations get too rigid, that's when they become stereotypes, those sort of oversimplified, often inaccurate generalizations about whole groups of people.
Right, and those stereotypes are exactly what makes this next concept, androgyny, so interesting, which your sources explore.
Yeah, androgyny. In the psychological context, it's not really about how someone looks physically.
No.
It's about showing a significant mix of traits. Some traditionally seen as masculine and some traditionally seen as feminine. A balance, sort of.
And the idea here, highlighted in your material, is that this mix potentially gives a person a wider range of behavioral options, right? You're not limited by those narrow gendered expectations if you feel comfortable expressing traits from both sides.
Precisely. And the key research discussed here is Sandra Bem's work from 1975 and her Bem sex role inventory.
That's the one.
Right.
She basically created this list of traits and had people rate them masculine, feminine, or neutral. Then, individuals would rate themselves on those same traits.
Right. And if you scored high on both the masculine and the feminine scales, you were classified as androgynous. It was an early attempt to kind of quantify this blend.
And the proposed benefit.
Oh.
Well, people scoring high on androgyny were suggested to have maybe better psychological adjustment, more flexibility in handling different situations, just a broader toolkit of behaviors, really.
But, and this is important for psych students evaluating research, your sources are careful to present the criticisms of Bem's work too.
Oh, yeah, definitely. It's often seen as reductionist, right?
Yeah.
Taking really complex aspects of identity and just boiling them down to scores on a list.
And it's potentially outdated. I mean, those specific traits Bem used back in the 70s might not capture how we understand gender expression now. And then there's the cultural bias. Were those traits universally masculine or feminine, or just within that specific 70s American context? These critiques really make you think about how we even measure something as fluid as gender expression.
Speaking of fluidity, let's look at how the environment shapes things. Your sources bring up environmental influences on gender development and androgyny.
Yeah, there's that Weisner and Wilson Mitchell study from 1990, a comparative look at different family environments.
Right, they looked at kids from families that actively tried to sort of downplay traditional gender roles compared to families who leaned into them more.
And the finding. Well, the children in families that didn't strictly enforce gender roles were more likely to show androgynous characteristics.
Which is pretty powerful evidence for the nurture side of things, isn't it?
Mm.
Shows how the environment can significantly influence how a child develops their gender expression.
Absolutely. And to show just how early that environment kicks in, your material includes the classic CV study from 75. This one always stands out.
Oh, totally. Adults interacting with a tiny baby, like 3 months old. The twist. They were only told the baby was either a boy or a girl, sometimes incorrectly.
And immediately, the adults started interacting differently based on that label, giving boy toys like trucks to the babies they thought were boys and girl toys like dolls to the ones they thought were girls,
Yeah.
even if the label was wrong.
That study gives such a clear, almost startling insight. Gender socialization, learning those gendered behaviors and expectations, it starts incredibly early, often just based on perception before a kid can even walk or talk.
It really underscores how pervasive that societal influence is right from the beginning.
Okay, shifting gears a bit. Your sources also tackle gender dysphoria. This is a really crucial concept for understanding gender identity from a psychological perspective.
Yes, and the definition provided is key. Significant distress caused by a mismatch between a person's biological sex assigned at birth and their internal sense of gender identity.
And the material clarifies some important terms, which is vital for discussing this respectfully and accurately. Like, transgender refers to someone whose gender identity doesn't align with the sex they were assigned at birth.
Right. And gender nonconforming just means not strictly following traditional gender expectations in behavior or appearance. Transsexual is a term sometimes used for people who've medically transitioned, though your sources correctly note that people have different preferences for terminology. It's important to be mindful of that.
Definitely. And importantly, transvestism, or cross-dressing, is clarified as distinct from gender dysphoria. They're not the same thing.
No. And the most vital point your sources make here, I think, is that being transgender does not automatically mean someone has gender dysphoria.
Right. Crucial distinction.
Dysphoria is specifically the distress part. Not all transgender people experience that level of significant distress. Gender dysphoria is that specific psychological phenomenon characterized by the internal conflict causing suffering.
That distinction is so important for a psychological understanding, focusing on the distress rather than just equating an identity with a disorder.
Exactly. Okay, so we've talked social factors, environment. Your sources also dig into biological explanations for gender development. This brings us into things like brain structure and hormones.
Yeah, there's evidence cited that suggests biological factors play a role in gender identity, including some studies looking at the brain itself.
The Craver study from 2000 is mentioned. It looked at a tiny brain area, the BSTC, the bed nucleus of the stria terminalis,
Okay.
and they found that in male to female transgender individuals, the number of neurons in this specific region was similar to that found in biological females, not biological males.
Interesting.
So this study is often brought up as evidence suggesting there might be a biological underpinning for gender identity, something physically located in the brain.
And there was another one mentioned, Hare et al., from 2009, finding that male to female transgender individuals were more likely to have a specific variation in an androgen receptor gene.
Right, which ties into the idea that hormones might influence gender development during critical prenatal periods.
Okay, so that connects to the prenatal hormone theory. The idea that exposure to sex hormones, like testosterone or estrogen, while the brain is developing in the womb, could influence later gender identity.
Yeah, the general idea being higher testosterone typically steers development towards male patterns, higher estrogen towards female patterns, in the brain as well as the body.
But, and this is a big but, your sources are very careful not to present these biological ideas as the whole story, right?
No, absolutely not. Just like with the social theories, there are important criticisms and complexities highlighted. A really big one is cause versus effect.
Ah, right. Could those brain differences seen in studies like Craver's be a result of living and identifying as a different gender rather than the cause of that identity? Brains are incredibly plastic, after all.
Exactly. And your sources bring up contradictory evidence, too, like the example of girls with congenital adrenal hyperplasia, CAH.
Okay, what's up?
So these are biological females exposed to unusually high levels of testosterone during prenatal development. Based on a simple hormone theory, you might expect that to strongly masculinize their gender identity.
Makes sense.
Yet, despite maybe having some physical masculinization or preferring activities often labeled masculine, they almost always grow up to identify as female.
Wow. So that CAH example really complicates a simple hormones equal identity idea, doesn't it? Shows biology isn't just a straightforward switch.
Definitely not. Ultimately, these biological explanations, while giving us fascinating clues, they just don't fully explain the whole picture on their own. They can't easily account for the huge role of environment and social factors we talked about earlier.
Which brings us neatly back around to the social learning explanation, another major theory your material covers for how gender develops.
Right. This theory, drawing heavily from Bandura's work, basically says we learn gender through observing others, imitating them, and being reinforced for certain behaviors.
So you watch role models, parents, friends, people in the media, see how they act in gendered ways.
Uh-huh. Then you imitate those behaviors.
hmm And if you get rewarded for those behaviors, maybe praise or just fitting in, feeling accepted, you're more likely to do them again. If you get discouraged or punished, you're less likely. Pretty straightforward learning principles.
Exactly. Now, your sources introduce a piece of research here that's often discussed and is quite controversial. Rakers and Lovaas from 1974.
Ah, yes. This study is often presented as an attempt to use these social learning principles to, well, change gender nonconforming behavior in a young boy.
That's how it's described. The reported method involved coaching the boy's mother to reinforce behaviors considered masculine, like playing with certain toys, and actively discourage behaviors considered feminine.
And the results, as published, indicated that the boy showed more behaviors considered masculine after about 3 years of this intervention.
No, it's crucial, as your sources point out, that this study faces major ethical criticisms today.
Absolutely. The whole idea of trying to cure gender diversity is seen by many now as deeply problematic, potentially harmful, and promoting stigma.
Right. And there are big questions about whether the observed change was even a genuine shift in internal identity, or just the boy learning to suppress certain behaviors to avoid negative consequences and get rewards.
It's a study often used to highlight the really serious ethical challenges and historical context in this field of psychology.
Exactly. Presenting it, based on your source, means reporting on the study and its stated methods and results, and crucially, the criticisms leveled against it. It's part of the literature's history, but needs that critical lens.
Okay, let's loop back briefly to biology because the sources provide a bit more detail on chromosomes and hormones, particularly looking at atypical patterns.
Sure. We start with the typical patterns. XY, usually for males, XX, usually for females. That Y chromosome normally drives male development.
But looking at conditions where there are atypical chromosome patterns can tell us more. Klinefelter syndrome, for example, is XXY.
Right. Individuals with XXY are often taller, might have less muscle tone or body hair, typically face infertility, and can develop some breast tissue. Your sources also mention potential psychological effects, maybe some difficulties with language or social skills, a higher risk for learning challenges.
Then there's Turner's syndrome, where someone has only one X chromosome, just X.
Yes. Individuals with Turner's are typically shorter, their ovaries don't function normally, so they often need hormone treatment for puberty, and they can have various other health issues. Psychologically, they often show weaker spatial and math abilities, though general intelligence is usually well within the typical range.
So these conditions really show how variations right down at the chromosomal level can link to distinct physical and sometimes cognitive profiles, reinforcing biology's complex role.
Definitely. And revisiting hormones. Your sources detail their influence beyond just prenatal development, too. Testosterone, for instance, is linked to things like aggression, competitiveness, spatial reasoning, muscle growth.
And estrogen plays that vital role in female development, but it's also thought to influence mood PMS is a common example, and maybe some cognitive skills, too.
And we touched on CAH earlier, but it's worth repeating because it's such a key piece of evidence against simple hormonal determinism, you know?
Right, the females with high prenatal testosterone who still usually identify as female.
Exactly. It shows it's not just a simple input-output system. And your sources also mention oxytocin, often called the bonding hormone.
Yes.
Produced by both sexes, but levels are higher in females, especially around childbirth and nursing. It's crucial for social bonding, attachment, and might contribute to some observed gender differences in social behaviors.
Wow, okay. We've really covered a lot of ground from those basic definitions and classic theories like BIMS to specific studies on environment and the brain, biological factors like chromosomes and hormones, and social learning.
And your sources do a good job laying out a framework for evaluating all this, looking at the strengths and limitations of the different approaches.
Yeah, like for biological approaches, the strengths are the evidence from brain scans and hormone studies, maybe explaining some patterns we see across cultures and giving us testable ideas.
But the limitations are significant, right?
Yeah.
Often the studies show correlation, not necessarily causation, like we said with the brain scans.
Exactly.
They don't fully explain the huge individual differences we see in gender expression, and sometimes they can seem to ignore the undeniable impact of culture and environment.
And then on the social side, the strengths are pretty clear.
Yeah.
They help explain why gender roles look so different across cultures and how they change over time. And they show how things like parenting and media absolutely influence development.
But their limitations, well, they sometimes struggle to explain universal gender patterns that might exist across cultures, maybe underestimating biology's role. And they have a hard time explaining cases where someone develops a strong gender identity that seems to go completely against all the socialization they received.
So the clear takeaway from your sources, and really what all these different studies collectively point to, is that gender development is just incredibly complex.
That's the word.
It's not nature or nurture. It's this dynamic, intricate dance between biology and environment, interacting in ways we're honestly still trying to fully figure out.
Absolutely. And for you, listening and engaging with this material, especially if you're a psychology student, your sources really boil down the key takeaways, the must-knows.
Okay, so point one, lock down that clear distinction between sex, the biological bit, and gender, the psychological and social bit. That's your anchor.
2, know those key studies we talked about, Bem, CV, Criver, Rikers, and others. Understand what they tried to do, what they found, and just as importantly, their limitations and the criticisms they face. Critical evaluation is key.
3, really internalize that understanding gender development means thinking about the interaction of biological and environmental factors. Avoid those simple either explanations.
4, when discussing gender dysphoria, aim for sensitivity and accuracy. Stick to the definition from your sources. It's about the significant distress caused by that mismatch.
5, always remember to place concepts like sex roles and stereotypes in their cultural and historical context. They aren't fixed or universal, they change.
And finally, number 6, practice evaluating all research critically. Always ask, what were the methods? Who was in the sample? Are there biases? Could there be other explanations for the findings? Don't just accept things at face value.
That feels like a really solid foundation to build on. We've seen how biology might provide a canvas, environment adds the paint and detail, and concepts like androgyny challenge rigid boxes. We've touched on complex topics like gender dysphoria and seen how even classic studies like Rikers and Lovas's force us to confront really important ethical questions.
Yeah. And maybe a final thought to leave you with. Given this incredible complexity and the ongoing discoveries in brain science, genetics, our understanding of social dynamics, how might future research move beyond just trying to sort people into simple categories? How can we better map and understand the truly rich, varied, and individual spectrum of human gender experience?
That's a question that feels absolutely central to where psychology needs to go in this area, doesn't it?
It certainly feels that way.
Well, we've taken a deep dive into a cornerstone topic in psychology: sex, gender, and androgyny. We've covered core definitions, key theories, landmark research, the interplay of biology and environment, and hopefully how to think critically about it all.
We really hope this conversation has helped synthesize the material you provided and given you some clear pathways for further thought and maybe even your own research.
Absolutely. Revisit those sources, dig deeper into the studies that caught your eye, and keep thinking about how these concepts connect to other areas of psychology you're exploring. Thank you so much for bringing this material to our deep dive today.
Yeah.